Muy buenos días, un gusto verlas y verlos. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos de vuelta a este segundo día de nuestra conferencia sobre el duelo y narrativa en primera persona. Good morning, delighted to see you all. Welcome back to the second day of our conference on grief and first person narrative. I am delighted to introduce our next speaker. She is Kathleen Higgins, full professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. And today she is, well, there's the title right there. She's going to talk about, so you want to write a grief memoir? Probably that doesn't require an introduction, no? Me agrado presentar a Kathleen Higgins, profesora titular de filosofía de la Universidad de Texas at Austin. Okay, with that, take it away.
Thank you. I'm glad you laughed at the title. I meant it to be a little bit funny. And I am starting with Roz Fast. Until yesterday, I hadn't realized that she had written a grief memoir, but I think that her cartoons often suggest what I see as a basic tension in connection with this very idea of wanting to write a grief memoir. This particular cartoon suggests a kind of, well, no action comics. In some sense, it doesn't seem like much of a comic to just sit and dwell. And there is something about the character of grief memoirs, I think, that resists something like a narrative form. But actually, the cartoon that I was especially thinking of when I made the title was one called Hermit Starter Kit. And it had 2 burlap back robes, a hammer for smashing credit cards, and a book called So You Want to Be a Hermit. The idea of having guidance in this seems a bit odd. And I think the idea that one would want to write a brief memoir full stop is strange also. One would not want to be in a position to write a grief memoir. However, many of us are in such a position and think of doing it. And so in some ways, what I'll be saying draws on my experience talking to a couple of literary agents and other people about how one might go about this. I can't say that the suggestions I got were necessarily encouraging, but perhaps they'll be a bit funny and maybe in the way illuminating. I thought I'd begin just by re-emphasizing a point that came up several times yesterday, that there is a tension in the project of writing a grief memoir. Regina Fabri has actually written a paper philosophically about grief memoirs recently, arguing that some people use testimony from grief memoirs as though it were phenomenological evidence. And I think she means really raw phenomenological evidence. And her point, which she suggests here, is that there has to be a double edge to this. It isn't going to be raw if it's actually presented to people at all. It's going to go through people's interpretation, which may change over the course of time. So her comment here, these literary artifacts are constrained by various literary and non-literary norms, pattern practices, and socioculturally shaped expectations about grief, remembrance, and self-narration. Consequently, grief memoirs should not be treated as if they were phenomenological evidence. I actually think this is way too strong. Of course, they're evidence of a sort. It's just one has to factor in the fact that it's interpreted evidence and evidence presented after the fact. But actually, when people are talking about the experience of psychological subjects, of course, they frequently rely on self-reports. So those are always going to be after the fact. But I think she makes a good point that there's a kind of double character as a result of this, more or less the same point in the second slide. So what I want to focus on today are what I see as contradictions in some ways in the very project of writing a brief memoir. Because to a certain extent, the experience of grief is chaotic, and writing a memoir has to be ordered. There's also usually the aim of giving some kind of honest testimony. And yet, to the extent that it is shaped, there's at least some question as to whether or not you're preserving the testimony in an honest way or being artful. And certainly talking to agents, a lot of pressure is put on the idea of being artful in the construction. My suggestion is going to be that these are basically artistic problems, and resolving them can actually enrich the memoir, and it might enrich the reflection on grief that furthers the project in its own way. But I'm going to dwell primarily on some of the contradictions. One kind of basic contradiction is, I think, even from the memoirist's point of view, there's often two sides to the motivation. One having to do with working through their own grief, the other having to do with communicating to others. So some people talk about making sense of their experience, rebuilding their identity. It's often been thought that there's a kind of way of maintaining connection with the deceased by writing in this context, possibly even resolving a crisis in the relationship, which clearly death in some sense is. But people also sometimes say, well, I wish I had a book that would have given me some indication of what might be going on. And I think that's often a motivation, the kind of obligation that came up as a theme a bit yesterday. On the other hand, from the reader's point of view, I think there are also a number of mixed motives. Of course, you can distinguish readers that are themselves grieving and readers that are interested, recognizing that they may themselves be grieving at some point. And some people are just interested in other people's stories altogether. But for those who are grieving, feeling a kind of solace, companionship, sense that their own experience can make sense to other people who shared it in certain ways, can be a motive, or also seeing how other people are dealing with a situation that they find themselves in, encouragement. But at the same time, there's often the desire for a good story. And I put editors' motives here because I found very unhelpful the suggestion that I should shape my grief memoir with the idea that it's going to be really encouraging. So one agent said, people are really going to want to see you dating again after my husband died. And I thought, well, that might be what they want to see. That's not really what happened. Do I want this to have anything to do? Maybe I should just write a novel instead and have somebody. And I don't think that would really be true to the experience. In fact, I suspect that a lot of readers are offended by the idea that, here's grief, it gets wrapped up, and that's that. Because that would not be true to anyone's actual experience, I think. So I didn't find that very helpful, but I found it illuminating with respect to what people who want to sell books might be thinking about. So basic duality, trying to be honest, real to the experience, and coping with formal issues, some of which have to do with the preferences of readers. One basic problem I see with trying to write a grief memoir is just that many features of grief are not very well suited to storytelling. I gotta go back to that Roz Chaz image. A lot of grieving does not involve a lot of action, to put it mildly. What it may involve are phenomenological states, I guess, states of mind that are not very familiar. And they may be so unfamiliar, it's hard to describe them. It's also likely that many readers are not going to find these very familiar states either. what can be part of the experience of grief is real incongruities. I mean, just the fact that, a pair of shoes that I might have looked at as, in the wrong place, just kind of flung off in a negative way, if they belong to my deceased husband, who flung them there after he's died, they have a completely different value. I mean, it seems very positive. That's one kind of incongruity. And people just living their lives in the usual way also can seem a bit incongruous. Like, why are you worried about that? That I think just this idea is just not very important any longer, can be a dominant theme in the memoirist's own mind, but not obvious how to get that across to other people. You don't even necessarily recognize yourself. So presenting yourself as a typical character may not be obvious. The sense of lack of progress of time, or time just flowing in a very different way, can be hard to convey. And in general, this lack of forward momentum. Even if you're doing things, it's as though there's kind of no point, no goal. Everything is just proceeding in a sluggish way. Though at the same time, there are a lot of emotions that externally may seem unprovoked, just coming, like as they happen to arise. Also, the sense of isolation, which maybe a memoir is trying to bridge, isn't always that easy to communicate if that is going to be part of your content. This is the point that was made by Lewis, but a recent grief theorist, Alan Kuster, has used the word world distancing for that sense that normalcy is just at a distance. So, space and time can seem to be not moving. Space, of course, it's the same space it always is, but you just don't feel really immersed in it. There's a kind of sensory numbness oftentimes, and a lack of coordination with other people's movements and so on. And just a general sense that you're not with the social vitality of the world. Another problem, again, one that was mentioned yesterday, language is very limited in the context of writing about grief. In fact, one of the most powerful aspects of the experience can be a sense that your words are going to fall short. And that's true from both the grieving person's experience and that of others. Denise Riley, who wrote very movingly about her experience after the death of her son, also points out that because she had this feeling of being out of time or time not moving, it makes it very hard to even use language that seems to require a kind of temporal movement. It's sequential. So one of her comments on this point is your very will to tell your violently novel state of timelessness is sapped because you sense that your most determined efforts can't reach others. You come to feel that syntax itself is set against you here because it must rely on conventional temporality to function at all. So all of these things, if one were to dwell on them, might make the point, the whole endeavor seem hopeless. Another problem, it's very hard to apply what are commonly viewed as principles of good storytelling. I present Aristotle here, since in the Western world, his definition of tragedy and the suggestions he made in connection with it have often been broadly applied to all kinds of writing, indeed, art, broadly speaking. So it's not that I think that writing a memoir is writing a tragic play, but I put his definition of tragedy here just to begin a discussion of some of his ideas that I think do apply. A tragedy is the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude, complete in itself, in language with pleasurable accessories, each kind brought in separately in the parts of the work, in a dramatic, not in a narrative form, with incidents arousing pity and fear, wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. Now, of course, Aristotle himself talks about narrative form, and clearly this isn't directly applicable to writing a memoir, but a number of themes that he brings up do seem potentially applicable. And as soon as you look at them, it becomes obvious why these seem a little bit problematic for grief. Primacy of plot. When I spoke to one literary agent, and I had shown her what I had written as a grief memoir, she pointed out, I think quite reasonably, that having this really upsetting scene at the beginning and then gradually getting calmer is not much of a plot. In fact, it's almost the reverse of a plot. I could see her point. Serious action. Clearly, the topic is serious, but is there action? That, in fact, is often the question. Am I even an agent when I'm grieving? It often seems a very passive experience. Completeness. People talk about closure, but often when they don't have it. I think that's why the topic comes up in connection with grief. And it's not clear what closure would even be in this context. And what is going to be the final point of it. I think it from now on, this is part of you. Whether some people do not like the idea that one grieves forever, and maybe one is not in an emotional state of distress forever, hopefully, but the idea that suddenly we've got a complete plot, beginning, middle, and end, as Aristotle puts it, doesn't seem very obvious either. I think catharsis of emotion is often what the memoirist would like, as would a reader. Maybe that is partly what is accomplished, but it's not immediately clear exactly how you're going to do that. Aristotle suggests that a good playwright should sketch the outline and then fill in episodes. That sounds broadly right about writing, but again, it's a little bit hard to know quite how to do that. I remember Aristotle talking about how you should be able to summarize what the plot is in a couple of sentences, and then everything else is an episode. But again, back to the question, what is the plot here? There are many episodes that could be part of it, but why? And then the lifelike characters idea. I think, in fact, this is often something that people do desire in a grief memoir. For example, to the extent they're talking about the deceased, there's a desire to present the deceased in realistic terms. Probably there's also a desire to present your own experience in realistic terms and not present yourself into artificially clear a way. Again, a goal, just a little bit challenging to see how to apply it. One thing I think is certainly the case, grief per se isn't the plot, at least as most people would define it. If you define it as a short-term episode of distress, that's really not a plot, but also what this overarching temporal arc should be doesn't seem to be well designed to create a plot. And given that when one writes a memoir about these things, that is often exactly what you have in view, I think that is at least a challenge that needs to be confronted. I looked at a few guides to writing memoirs to see what people were advising and how they might or might not apply. So in one guide, which interestingly often brought up kinds of memoirs that did deal with grief as illustrations. So clearly they think these were successful memoirs. The idea was, well, you can make different kinds of structures that aren't exactly the structure of the sequence of experience, but these can be effective for storytelling. So chronology is one possible structure. By itself, you probably need more to make a plot. But certainly if you're using a diary approach, for example, if you are presenting, like episodes that do follow one another in a sensible way, chronology is possible. But it's also possible to keep returning to a scene over and over again, which I think Didion does to some extent in Year of Magical Thinking. Or it can be much more associative. One episode recalls another. I think actually in academic writing, we often do this when we make a point and then bring in support from some other people. So perhaps a kind of memoir equivalent of that. They consider things like diary approaches or various images of a person in a photo album kind of way, a collage. They also mention parallels between one set of events and another set of events. So, what's happening to you when you're a child, what's happening to you now, possibly going back and forth between that, or even coming back to a scene as a way of creating some structure where structure seems lacking. And in fact, I think a lot of the challenges that I've just been talking about do suggest some strategies to use. It's just, I'm just emphasizing that I think they need to be thought about. One question is, what is the theme? If grief is too nebulous to be a theme in itself, and I'll mention some possible themes in a minute, what is the theme of this memoir going to be? Some of us were talking yesterday about the fact that there are often multiple stories that could be told, and maybe the same author will tell various stories in different forms, but any particular story probably needs a theme. Reliable narrator is certainly what readers are expecting, and I think what anyone writing a grief memoir would aim to be. I think that maybe comes with the territory. Another thing that memoir guides often emphasize, and I think this can be used very effectively, is sensory detail. Even if the sensory details are somewhat abnormal, like my sudden enthusiasm for shoes flung in no particular direction, the fact that there's something concrete there can be really valuable. I remember in the context of grieving for a mentor, being in a state where I really wasn't tasting food much for a while. And then one day I bit into an apple, and it was just like a revelatory experience. And it seemed like there was a kind of movement in grief, because at that moment it was like I was really feeling sorry for my deceased mentor who couldn't be having that experience. But that was a change in the way of thinking of him. One of the challenges, I think, is to make the story have a catalyst, something that kicks it off. Obviously, in experience, what kicks off grief is the death of someone that you care about. But that isn't always a story's catalyst. And so I think I keep having to remind myself when writing that the catalyst of the story is from the perspective of the reader, not from the perspective of having a brief story to tell. The catalyst can maybe create a certain kind of narrative drive, but finding some, like the opposite of my being very upset and getting calm, which is not drive. Finding some way of creating narrative drive is an issue, and a compelling structure, I think, maybe can follow from both of those, but keeping in mind that readers are reading it structurally, I think, is important as well. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that having a theme in some sense is vital, and a theme that's more specific than grief writ large. And I think this can be very helpful once it's selected, because then what's part of the theme can be a means of editing or choosing which details of one's experience to select and might help organize. On the other hand, it may limit the achievement in terms of therapy. Like if it's just to make sense of your experience, because it's taking one aspect, it may have its limitations for doing something that's more holistic and bringing together these threads of experience. But I think there are a lot of possible themes that could work and have worked in some people's memoirs. I mean, even the altered state as a theme in itself. Denise Riley's account of this experience after her son died really focuses on a sense of not moving along with time. And that's really what she focuses on. And a lot of aspects of grief work, make their appearance in that context. But that is the focus, and she kind of tightly sticks to that. A crisis of faith could certainly be a theme. And that would even suggest a kind of resolution, assuming the crisis is confronted and dealt with. Discovering the deceased, I think, could be a theme. I think in some ways, Joyce Carol Oates, who reflects on the fact that she wasn't really sure that she ever really knew her husband, and does spend some time, I think, in a particularly effective part of her quite long memoir, thinking about something that he had written that she found in his office, and thinking about him in connection with that. In some ways, I think that stands out as memoir in itself. Recovering a sense of home or continuity. I remember that when I was first writing an essay on grief, one of my friends said, you know, what people really want to know is, how do you normalize life in any way after this? And I think that finding some degree of normal could be an aim for a narrative as well, or finding continuity with yourself, that in some ways you become such a strange person to yourself for a while, getting on a keel that doesn't, you know, forget about the grief, of course, but incorporates it into a way of living that you recognize again as your own. Negotiating the relationship. In some way, this is the aim that I had in what I had written of a grief memoir, at least so far, because I wrote it in the form of letters to my late husband. And a lot of it did have to do with my sense that, you know, gee, I didn't know what was happening. You know, if I'd known what was happening, I would have done something, you know, not as if that would have made a lot of difference, but that was an overwhelming feeling that I thought in some ways addressing with him would be a plot. I think as a plot, it kind of works, although I'm not sure that what I've written so far does. embarking on a new project or journey can be a theme. The memoir, H is for Hawk, about grieving and taking up falconry at the same time, certainly would not be everyone's approach to the topic. But the way that that memoir is written, like dealing with grief and embarking on this project of training the hawk and, sort of learning features of, hawk behavior and how to do this, and eventually letting the hawk be free, works thematically very nicely in a quite surprising way. Some memoirs have an activist agenda. The case of one memoir, and Claudia Brenner wrote a memoir about her lesbian partner being murdered because of their relationship. And so part of what she's dealing with is, anti-gay behavior and confronting that as she goes. And also a grief memoir that launches from, this is Becky Altman. Can't read my own small font. She wrote a memoir that launches from being in a grief group where everyone insists that you have to go through certain stages. And she finds this so off-putting and harmful to her own state of mind that she organizes a different group with other like-minded people. It becomes kind of a book club. That also seems possible. So I've moved along without realizing it. That's where I want to be. I guess one question in general is, what kind of story is this going to be? And again, that isn't something that is obvious on the basis simply of it's going to be about grief, or at least the details aren't. Arthur Frank has written about the stories people tell when they confront serious illness. And he has these three general categories. These are stories they tell to themselves, the way in which they describe what's going on with them. One of them is restitution, and this is the possibility of getting back to a state of health, which in some cases is more realistic than others. But what's going on in the meantime? That's one kind of story people tell. Another is just, he calls a chaos narrative, where one thing happens after another, and it's, in some ways, he says it's not really a narrative form, it's an anti-narrative form, because a person is having so much trouble putting it all together. And a further idea is quest narrative, where there's some aim in view that is not directly just recovering health, but it becomes maybe a kind of spiritual experience, say, or somehow growing through the experience. Paul Lauritsen, like many others, has applied this categorization to grief stories as well, but he points out that clearly restitution in a straightforward sense isn't going to be happening. So really the probable aim, if it's not going to be a chaotic story, is going to be a quest. And that suggests that whatever story is being told, having some aim in view, perhaps one that emerges, but as a writer, having its emergence in view is probably going to be pretty valuable. And that in some ways I think is maybe unsurprising, that memoirs often are stories of growth in some way. And it's very unlikely that they're going to be stories where one goes back to normal innocence of what grief involves, confronting loss, and so on. And I think this is, again, something that is going to reflect the tension between the two motivations I began talking with, namely the desire to describe what happened in truthful terms and also to artfully construct it. But I thought in some ways, this is exactly the tension that Plato gets at when he talks about the tension between poetry and philosophy. Given that he's writing dialogues that many people would say have high literary value, obviously he thought this is a tension that one can work through. Whether his way of doing it is what one would prefer is another question. But I think that one possibility that this opens up is that the artistic problems themselves can help the project of further understanding of grief. Processing goals can be accomplished as well. One other thought I had in this connection, since one of my other roles is as Nietzsche scholar, I often throw Nietzsche in for fun. One of Nietzsche's ideas I think is really great and underappreciated is the idea of being superficial out of profundity. And he writes about this in a preface to the second edition of The Gay Science, where he is talking about having been ill for a while and then coming out of it and his thoughts as a convalescent. And one of the things that he points out is that in some ways, just loving the surface of things again after being in the depths is something of great value. And he praises the Greeks in this connection. Oh, those Greeks, they knew how to live. What is required for that is to stop courageously at the surface, the fold, the skin, to adore appearance, to believe in forms, tones, words, and the whole Olympus of appearance. Those Greeks were superficial, out of profundity. And what he meant by that was that you might look at Greek mythology and think that there's a kind of lightness of having gods, play games with human beings, terrible from our perspective, but they're petty jealousies and so on. His suggestion is that it's not because the Greeks were superficial that they had these stories. It's because there was so much depth of understanding and confrontation with the really harsh aspects of life that they developed this more serene world of gods with their jealousies and so on. And I think in some ways that's the character of the project, this notion of superficiality out of profundity, that dealing with grief is something that does resist language and so on. And so one has to come out of the depths to a certain extent to engage with form at all. That suggests that a certain amount of processing or the therapeutic goal has to precede constructing a grief memoir in its, in the full edited sense. And that is a divergence from therapy, but that can mean that the goal of the memoir itself changes, and that I think itself can contribute to dealing with grief. So hopefully the two can come to a convergence. I'll leave it there. Ah,
Would have in contrast to speaking to an adult that knows that someone's going to die, that has heard from it before. There's a darkness in telling these kind of subjects.
yeah, what a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously there would be the need to think about a child's point of view. I guess one thing that comes to mind is not being too superficial. I mean, I think the aim to have a happy ending, especially in what we tell children, is a strong motive. But I think that that is not a completely available possibility. One thing that comes to mind, although it's not about a literary form, but a project that I've heard of children in a kind of grief camp, like a camp for grieving children, is that they make lanterns that they decorate with their artworks for their deceased loved one, and then at night light them up. And I think the idea that there are continuities would be one theme that one would certainly want to bring up. In that context, of course, just being around other people that are experiencing loss, I think is really valuable, because I think that for children, it's very easy to feel completely abandoned in the world and misunderstood by everyone around them. And I can't imagine how horrible it would be to go to school. Everybody else is as usual, and you're completely changed. So I think that would be, if there could be a literary analogy to directing one's love and, you know, kind of communicative urges toward the deceased, that's a possibility. I suppose in stories that help adults, often the idea of something that has remained the same, but now with further meaning, can often be a form that's helpful. And so I guess some symbolic equivalent to that in a children's story. You know, like now we do this on behalf of mom, or, you know, like we can, you know, convey our love to mom by putting flowers here every week, or something along those lines. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful question.
¿Puedo preguntar? Yo, sí. Gracias. Bueno, esta pregunta, quizás, como no tengo buena inglés, quizás ya mencionó algo de esto y no lo puedo entender. ¿De qué manera nuestra tradición occidental respecto a la literatura puede presentar problemas en relación a la forma bueno, de expresar o de narrar o de contar lo que estamos tratando? ¿Por qué lo pregunto? Porque de alguna manera, claro, en la tradición occidental está el tema, por ejemplo, del conflicto, del clima. Hay una serie como de, bueno, que vienen de Aristóteles, que ella también lo mencionó, ¿no? Como que hay una forma de entender la narrativa, por ejemplo, ¿cierto? Y la tragedia, en fin. Y, por ejemplo, hay otras tradiciones occidentales. Recuerdo alguna vez haber escuchado a Lucrecia Martel decir que en la literatura japonesa o la literatura china no es tanto del conflicto necesariamente. O sea, como que hay y por ejemplo, hay una tradición, tiene que ver un poco con lo que comentaba el profesor Miguel ayer también, digamos que la forma, digamos, no es inocente. Y hay ejemplos de haiku, por ejemplo, de tantas sobre la muerte, y que claro, pues tienen una estructura muy particular propia de esa tradición. Entonces, ¿de qué manera la tradición occidental puede presentar problemas respecto a...
Great. Yeah, muchas gracias, muy interesante la pregunta. So he's asking about because you mentioned, going back to Aristotle,
Mhm.
kind of certain literary forms and structures that characterize, a certain Occidental tradition. But what about other traditions
Mhm.
coming from other places that think about successful literary structure or narrative structure or poetic structure in different terms?
Mhm.
And is there something maybe specifically challenging, limiting, or problematic, or indeed beneficial perhaps, about that Occidental framing, and what about these other possible framings
Yeah.
or constraints?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, forms that I think often work to further reflection on grief. I don't know that they're memoirs exactly. I think they often do allow for more open space than a memoir form. So you mentioned haiku. I think that can certainly, I think a haiku is a very delicate form because it's so compressed. And also, if it really brings something into focus, it can create so much reverberating thought. Yeah, I think that's very wonderful. No plays from Japan often involve ghost stories. And one that I have found a lot of meaning in is about a priest who's making a journey, stops at a temple that was known to have had this famous pair of lovers of yesteryear. And he meets a woman who is, like he chats with about that. Then he falls asleep, and it turns out that the woman in the dream was the manifestation of the woman in the story. And it becomes this, like further meditation on time and the experience. And the ghost in the dream is actually mourning her husband, um, which, in some literal sense of time makes no, assuming there are ghosts and they're both dead, you have the sense that, well, they're in the same time zone, but they aren't. And just like the reverberating thoughts of that, I just find dazzling. So I think that that's of great value too. It's just, I'm not sure how a memoir, maybe a very succinctly expressed memoir at moments, leaves those kind of spaces. But I agree with you. I think there are other forms that are also really valuable in connection with grief.
Yeah, and then I will add myself to the list. Okay, you go ahead.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
As always. So at one point when you were going over parts of a good story, you talked about having lifelike characters. And I think that this was a setup for discussing some of the challenges to grief memoirs and achieving like a good story. But I lost track of how it would be difficult to achieve this part of a good story, if that was a point that you're making.
Right.
So I want to know what you're thinking there. And also, I've been thinking about this issue of creating lifelike characters in grief memoirs, because there are some who would resist certain ways of creating lifelike characters when it comes to the dead.
Yes.
So there's a kind of resistance to presenting the dead in a lifelike
Right.
way,
Warts and all.
or or just there's this concern that like to write about the dead in a lifelike way would be to like reanimate the dead, or to fictionalize them, or to like breathe life into the dead in a way that would be inappropriate or obscene. So like if you imagine someone attempting to put dialogue into the
Yes.
mouth of someone who's dead, for example,
Yes.
that could be thought of as a way of presenting them in a lifelike manner, like really bringing sort of the person forth. But you might have objections to this kind of practice, this way of doing it.
Right.
So the first question is, what did you think would be difficult about achieving this in a grief memoir? And what do you make of some of these like reservations or objections to attempts to create a lifelike portrait of someone who is dead.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily think that trying to create a lifelike portrait of the dead is difficult. What I do think in connection with that, though, is there's a place for space. What creates a lifelike portrait is enough of a sketch that people who know the person recognize, like see, yes, that's exactly what that person would do. I think that can be very healing for a lot of people because it, makes the dead someone we still relate to. And I think to me, that's a more, I would probably think that a more important motive than fear that it might not have been exactly what the person would have said. On the other hand, I agree with the sense that turning the deceased into one's puppet is what you want to avoid. I mean, I don't think that does anyone any good. But when thinking about chatbots of the dead, you might say, well, is this not puppetry? It's true that AI makes up what the dead person supposedly says and not, me individually. And so it's a more compelling illusion, but it is such an illusion that I can see reason for strong reservations about that. And I think one of the reasons that I'm a little bit more skeptical of that is, again, the spaces. I mean, what I think one really wants to engage with is a kind of sense of the possibility of an encounter with at least the person as one knows the person, which is not to say that I expect ghosts to appear, but I think to, really think about the person as that person. You can, when that happens, I think it's because you recognize the person having their own mysterious aspect. And this kind of makes everything too literal and blatant. Like, okay, this is what she would have said. Like, let's have a machine do it and, have it appear that these words are coming out of the mouth. I don't think that that is really engaging in this relating to the dead. That may be a substitution. I mean, for some people, maybe not, but I'm dubious.
And you also had, conversations with editors and other people. So I wonder for you, also if there are readers or people, what the role of other readers is and other people's opinions and how you sort of balance those things of your own solitary process and the Ross Chess cartoon and engaging with others.
Yeah, I don't think I could ever shut up about my situation after my husband died. But I mean, that's not to say I was showing them what I was writing. I was, in fact, writing letters to my late husband as a self-contained project. Then it occurred to me that actually writing something in, like in the spirit of that would be a good form for writing. And I guess to me, the thought was, as I guess for many, like people should know about this. I think that is one of the odd feelings in grief. It's like, do people realize this is happening? I mean, in one sense, many people do. In one sense, no, not at all. And so I think that there is this feeling that it would be helpful to just say this in case it's abuse. So I guess in terms of writing and showing anything to people, some people, when I said I was doing it, I would show like the first letter or something like that. Because I started with very upsetting scene. Many were, they weren't upset with me necessarily, but they found it a very upsetting scene. But then mostly I wrote it, and then if people asked to see it, I would show it to them.
I'm gonna add myself to the list here. So I, as someone who's really struggling with these issues now, because I'm in the process of writing a brief memoir, this has been so interesting to me and so useful. And yeah, so and what I want to do, I mean, in particular, just the notion of a profound tension between what you could think of as therapeutic aims or goals or values, but you could also think of those as kind of relational. And I'm sure the relational can be reduced to the therapeutic. In fact, I wouldn't necessarily want to do that. But there's that pole or that kind of strand. And then the aesthetic considerations that have to do with, you know, successful artistic achievement and the relationship to the reader and all the rest of that. And there are so many profound and multi-layered tensions there. So I just have really appreciated the light that you are shedding on that. And then I guess what I wanted to do in my question to you is to push you a little bit on this notion of theme. Because what struck me as I was listening to you is that what is doing the work in my own thinking about these questions now, in the place of theme, I am now, what I see there is actually this very sharp distinction that Vivian Gornick draws between the situation and the story, right? And I think it's interesting here because what she draws this very sharp distinction, and she thinks it's that sharp distinction that is what explains the artistic success, right, of memoir and of first person writing. And of course, I mean, for those who maybe are not familiar, the situation is the raw material. It's the events, the circumstances, the relationships, the traumas. It's the lived experience itself, which in the case of brief memoir would include the death of a loved one. And then the story, right, is the meaning made from the material. So it's the intellectual and the emotional understanding that the writer has achieved over time about what those events signify, right? So it's the shape, insight, perspective, or truth discovered that organizes the narrative. And what I think is interesting here is that if the situation and the story actually do the work that you, I think, are grouping under theme in some way, what is interesting is that there's an essential tension there. There are two poles. The situation and the story are in tension with each other, right? Because the story has to be made, right, achieved, right, through and of the situation. And that's a difficult and fraught project, right? And it's part of what makes the relationship between the situation and the story so interesting, right? It's multipolar. There's two poles, and there's this kind of constant tension there. Whereas if you think of all of that simply as theme, it seems like theme is there's a single pole, there's a single focus. I think some of your examples were discovering the deceased or crisis of faith. But when theme is expressed at kind of such a high level of abstraction, I think what it might obscure is this essential tension between the situation and the story, right? Which I think ends up doing some of the work that you ascribe to theme in making the memoir artistically viable, successful, and so on. So I just would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the case, but I think it might be that when I was suggesting that one needs a theme, that this would be something that would be, you know, like you start with a theme. I don't think you start with a theme.
Right.
I think actually writing can be a context in which you discover what the theme is.
Yeah.
But I think that the theme needs to guide what the presentation ultimately becomes. So that would be, you know, when you're at the point where, you know, like the story or the meaning has emerged, then that starts to be the editing device that, you know, like determines whether this is moving toward that or away from that.
So just to clarify, so then on your understanding, what you're calling theme would probably map onto Gornick's distinction as the story. Is that right?
More or less. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. That's clear.
Yeah, but I was just, you know, thinking that there are thematic types
Yes.
that one can distinguish among.
Yeah. I can go on. I think there are thematic types, But I think part of, at least in what I have appreciated about Warnick's book by the same name, Situation in the Story, which I've reread several times just recently, so it's part of why I'm so animated about this, is that, yeah, themes can be expressed in types, so they're more abstract, they're more general, they're types. Whereas I think what is so interesting about her characterization of the story is that it is in this essential dialogue with the situation, and the situation is irreducibly particular, right? So it's
Yes.
not, the story cannot be a type, I think,
Yeah.
for Gornick, in the same way that a theme could be a type for you.
Well,
say.
yes.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
an interesting,
Yeah, but with the theme, I was trying to get at the fact
At this
that
higher
you can't
level.
go to the raw material and expect that to make a story.
yeah.
The story is gonna have to have a shape that.
But then you could
extract
generalize
the
them out
theme
in this
from.
way,
Yes.
yeah, okay, that's super helpful, thank you.
So you were considering these brief, you were considering these brief memoirs as stories and
Mhm.
thinking about parts of a good story and the challenges that are inherent in these brief memoirs to achieving that. And there was a typology that came out of thinking about memoirs and stories. And I guess I tend to think about the brief memoirs that I engage with most closely as philosophical works. And that would suggest like a different typology and different possibilities and different features of like a good brief memoir. And I wonder if that's like a way that you engage with brief memoir, and if I think maybe to some extent this is not how an editor or might
Right.
be thinking about a brief story, but in fact, some of these works are philosophical works in their own right, and the evaluation of them, I think, would depend on seeing them as such. And I wonder if that was a way that you thought about them, and if that would suggest different sort of scheme than the one that you're working with here.
I'm sure that does affect what I prefer to see. I mean, I like Denise Riley's very philosophical discussion of timelessness. And if it does seem too much, on the surface events, sometimes that is not as interesting to me. I guess I have a kind of mixed intuitive response to what you said. I do think that there is a philosophical take on reality and on death and the experience of the loss of a loved one that is important to me, and a memoir that I find valuable. On the other hand, I don't think that can exactly be the foreground if it's a good story. I mean, I think that that can emerge in various ways, but maybe it's more on the level of the abstracted theme that, like meaning that is found. H is for Hawk, for example. A lot of the discussion is very much about, just what's involved in training this hawk. And I think the meaning starts to emerge from having a project that is evocative for her for reflection. But the project is really what's driving the story. And I think it would have been a less maybe valuable story without something like the project. That's the focus. So I don't think a grief memoir is very much like a journal article, say. I mean, it's just going to have a different structure than that. And how much people foreground what comes in and out of their mind. I mean, again, Riley's is not terribly situated in other things that are happening with her. A lot of it is, very thoughtful about, like how alienating this experience is and how difficult it is to communicate with people in it. that's a very abstract level of meaning, not at all like, how do I train a hawk? So I think it can happen in different ways, but I often think that by whatever is what people are talking about, doing and thinking, that the meaning emerges. It's not going to be something that's just staying on the level of abstraction, I don't think, at least as far as memoir structure is concerned.
We have a few more minutes, in case there's any other questions. We can start our coffee break straight away. Are we? Seems that we're ready for coffee. Thank you again.
Thank you.